Ms. Graham.
Thank you very much. We had just moved on to the final post-mortem report.
Yes.
And this was dated the 18th of June 2015. Can we have that back on the screen, please? We'll just see the first page. So this is page 2 of the PDF. Final report, 18th of June 2015. And if we move down the page, do we see the medical cause of death? There's 1A, sudden death in a man intoxicated by MDMA, ecstasy and alpha PVP whilst being restrained. The autopsy was on the 4th of May 2015 and the examining doctors were Dr. Kerry Ann Shearer and Dr. Ralph Buhadir.
Yes.
They were the forensic pathologists. And then if we can, just before we leave that page, we heard evidence from John McSporran about the final post-mortem coming in. They'd been waiting for that. And
yes.
So this was at a point where you had statements from the attending officers. They'd been given on the 4th of June. And then on the 18th, 2 weeks later, the final post-mortem comes in. All the investigations have been completed at that point.
Okay.
And Mr. McSporran gave evidence on the 16th of February about this. And he said the final report was available and the cause of death was known to the investigators in relation to the final report. On that date, when the final post-mortem came in, were you in a position to read the post-mortem?
I didn't. I can't remember it being passed to me at that stage, no.
Would you have, we've heard of the complexity and the significance of the death of Mr. Mayo.
Yeah.
We've heard a number of witnesses give evidence about the significance of this investigation to PIRC. And would you have expected to have been shown that final post-mortem report?
I was certainly briefed in relation to the content.
And who gave you that briefing?
Well, I discussed it both with Mr. McSporran and also Mr. Mitchell, I think.
Right.
At some point, I don't know if it was on this day.
Would it have been, if it wasn't on this day, would it have been shortly after it came in?
Yes, I would think so.
And was that a discussion that took place in their building or in your office?
I think it was in the other building. And I don't think it was actually together. I think they were separate. Oh,
you had two separate discussions with each of them. Tell us when your discussion with Mr. McSporran took place. Do you remember?
I don't. I wouldn't be able to place it in terms of time.
Right. Are you able? All right. Well, maybe it doesn't matter. Which discussion was first?
I don't know. I really don't know.
And when you say you were given a briefing, can you tell us what was the briefing you were given?
Well, it was what the post-mortem's final cause of death was given as.
And what were you told about that?
Just exactly what's on the screen, the sudden death in a man intoxicated with MDMA and alpha PVP whilst being restrained.
Was there any reason you didn't read the full post-mortem yourself?
I did eventually, yes.
Right. When you say eventually, when do you mean?
Sometime within, I don't know, I would imagine within a few weeks of receiving this.
Right. So the briefing you received essentially relayed to you the medical cause of death as we see on the screen?
Yes.
Was there any other information given to you at that time by either Mr. McSporran or Mr. Mitchell about the report itself?
Yes, I was given information in relation to the injuries to the body. I was given information in relation to the results that have come back from toxicology, obviously. And at that time, I think we also had the neuropathologist's report that had been incorporated in this. And there had been updates given throughout as those elements were getting pulled together.
Right, thank you. Would you describe that as a sort of general overview of the post-mortem findings?
Yes.
Can we look please at pages, page 16 of the PDF and page 15 of the post-mortem report itself? You'll see that this is headed up Final CNS Autopsy Diagnosis, Brain Evolving Global Ischemia, and the conclusions start here. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can we look at the next page, please? Page 16 of the report and 17 of the PDF. And I'm interested in the paragraph that starts, given the circumstances provided, which is just below. Given the circumstances provided, toxicological findings and lack of another cause of death at post-mortem, the possibility of excited delirium syndrome has been considered in this case. Mm-hmm. It is, however, a psychiatric and not a pathological diagnosis, and there is some debate in the forensic community with regards to its application as a cause of death.
Yes.
What was your understanding at that time of the syndrome? Or did you have an understanding of it?
I didn't have an understanding. My understanding was effectively based on what was contained in the post-mortem report.
So was that something you were made aware of during the briefing? Or
yes, when the
you
report,
read it?
Yeah.
All right, so it was when you were given
When
a
I was
briefing.
given the update, yeah.
So excited delirium was mentioned during the briefing?
Yes.
Either with Mr. McSpadden or Mr. Mitchell?
Yes.
All right. What awareness did you have prior to that briefing about excited delirium or its reference and significance?
Very, very minimal information or understanding around it.
Were you enlightened by the briefing you received?
Well, following or at around the same time as the briefing, there was a further meeting with Crown Office staff about it, and there was a discussion in relation to how it really wasn't widely accepted.
So did you then become clear from that discussion with Crown Office that it was viewed as a psychiatric, not a pathological diagnosis?
Yes, that was clear.
Thank you. Can we move on to page 17 of the report, which is page 18 of the PDF, the following page? And I'd like to look at the paragraph, taking everything into consideration. Death here was sudden in nature. In summary, there was no evidence of gross or histological natural disease that would account for death. Toxicology revealed MDMA and alpha-PVP, and these drugs could potentially have caused sudden death at any time due to a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. That said, it is recognised that restraint in itself can be a cause or contributing factor in some deaths. And given the circumstances, in that this man was restrained at the time of his respiratory arrest and post-mortem examination showed petechial hemorrhages, that may represent a degree of asphyxia, it cannot be completely excluded that restraint has also had a role to play in death here. You see that?
Yes.
Then overall, it is not possible to be sure what has been the most significant factor in death here, and as such, the cause of death is best regarded as being sudden death in a man intoxicated by MDMA, ecstasy, and alpha-PVP whilst being restrained. And there were no other significant findings, and the cause of death then became, as we said earlier, sudden death in a man intoxicated by MDMA, ecstasy, and alpha-PVP whilst being restrained.
Yes.
Can I ask you about the paragraph that talks about restraint in itself can be a cause or contributing factor in some deaths? It's at the top of the screen there. And given the circumstances in that this man was restrained at the time of his respiratory arrest and post-mortem examination showed petechial hemorrhages that may represent a degree of asphyxia, it cannot be completely excluded that restraint has also had a role to play in death here. Do you have an understanding, I appreciate you were a lawyer for many years, do you have an understanding of the phrase when something is de minimis.
Yes.
And is it your understanding that if there's a reference to something being de minimis, as lawyers would say, that it's something that's de minimis would be something that was trifling or insignificant,
Yes.
or a minimal matter?
Yes.
And that if something is trifling or insignificant, it can be excluded as being a factor.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So here in the postmortem report, when it says that restraint can be a cause or contributing factor in death, and it cannot be completely excluded that restraint has also had a role to play in death here, what was your understanding of that explanation by the pathologists in the report?
Well, that it could be a factor in the death, I certainly didn't regard it as de minimis.
Thank you. So it was your understanding of this report that restraint was not being excluded by the pathologists as de minimis or insignificant.
That's right, yes.
Was it your understanding that restraint was a factor which had given a material contribution to the death?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
We've heard evidence that the cause of death was multifactorial. That
Yes.
was the word that was
Okay.
used. Was that your understanding?
I wouldn't have used that word, but yes, I thought there were a number of factors.
And we've seen the cause there, that ecstasy is named,
Yes.
alpha PVP was named,
Yes.
and restraint is named.
Yes.
We've actually now heard evidence, it's not within the body of the final report, but we've heard evidence that the struggle against restraint is also a factor.
Mhm.
I don't think that's relevant for my purposes
Okay.
today, but that is evidence that's available to the chair. We've also heard evidence from Mr McSporran about the final post-mortem report and the
Mhm.
cause of death. He gave evidence, and I'll quote from what he said on the 16th. What it doesn't say is that restraint contributed to the death. What it says is sudden death in a man intoxicated by ecstasy and alpha PVP whilst being restrained, so it didn't say restraint contributed to the death. And he repeated that final post-mortem report does not say that restraint contributed. It simply says he died from drug intoxication whilst being restrained. And it doesn't say how much the restraint may or may not have contributed to the death. What do you make of that explanation from your lead investigator?
Well, from my reading of the report, I would suggest that restraint was being viewed as a contributing factor.
So you don't agree with Mr McSporran's position?
Well, not that interpretation, no. And in fact, we went on to seek expert medical evidence to look at the restraint.
Right. But on the face of this final post-mortem report,
Yes.
death is a material contribution, restraint is a material contribution
Yes.
to death. In terms of you as Commissioner and your expectations of your investigators, would you have expected your investigators to have a clear and accurate understanding of material contribution, or a cause that is the sole cause or a contributory factor in cause of death?
I think they would have some understanding, perhaps not to the degree that you or a civil lawyer would understand.
So in terms of your own investigators at that time, would you have expected them to recognise the phrase material contribution?
I would have thought so.
Would you have expected them to understand the concept of something that was de minimis or trivial and should be excluded?
Yes.
And would you have expected them to understand what it meant for a factor to be a contributing cause to a death?
I would have thought that reading the report itself makes it quite clear. It says that restraint in itself can be a cause, and then goes on to detail the circumstances around it.
And again, thinking about your expectations of your investigators, if the investigators were confused about cause of death or uncertain about the meaning and how the report should be interpreted, what would you have expected them to do as a first port of call?
Well, either approach their line managers, either the head or the director, and he in turn could have been approaching me.
So a lead investigator could have spoken to, in May 2015, either Irene Scullion or John Mitchell.
Yes.
And if they remained unclear or there were issues which neither of those senior managers could assist with, would you have been available to provide that assistance?
Yes.
And is that something you would have been willing to help your investigators with if that request had been made?
Well, yes.
And you were available from the 18th of June?
Yes.
Would you have expected the lead investigator or someone on his behalf to even contact one of the pathologists to discuss matters with them if confusion lingered?
If there was any requirement or he felt the need for clarification, yes.
Is that something you would normally expect your investigators to do, or was that not that common?
I don't think it would have been common, no.
But would there have been anything to stop the lead investigator perhaps seeking further clarification from the pathologist, if required?
Not that I'm aware of.
So if we've heard that, I've given you the evidence of Mr. McSporran, read that out to you, if we've heard that he didn't go back to the pathologist or didn't seek further guidance in relation to cause of death and remained under the view that, as I say, the final postmortem didn't say that restraint contributed to the death, does that surprise you?
Well, it surprises me in the regard that, as I say, experts were commissioned specifically to look at restraint. So I don't know how, having gone from a lack of understanding of this to then instructing or commissioning experts, we got to that position.
So if we take Mr. McSporran's evidence on the face of it as his position, does that give you cause for concern in relation to the understanding your investigators had about material contribution and its contribution to the death?
My position is that there was a recognition of restraint. So I am surprised if there's been any misunderstanding or lack of understanding of it.
In May 2015, were you aware that there may have been some confusion around this matter?
No.
Was that ever drawn to your attention that there was perhaps uncertainty or confusion about material contribution?
No.
Sorry, I interrupted.
It was regarded that the drugs, the restraint, I think from recollection, I haven't gone back through this, but I think the sprays were considered to not have played a part.
That's correct.
As I recall. So the discussions that I was privy to related to cardiac problems, the drugs and the restraint.
Right. So as far as you were concerned in May 2015, was there any information available to you to suggest that there had been some fundamental misunderstanding or confusion
No.
about the cause of death?
No.
Can I ask you about a paragraph in your statement, please? 610. I remember a meeting with Crown Office staff following receipt of the final post-mortem report, which had been inconclusive. I'm interested in that word that you use there. In what way did you view the final post-mortem report as inconclusive?
I suppose a better word there would have been unascertained in relation to what had been the cause of, the final cause of death.
Can you explain what you would have expected from the post-mortem to render the view conclusive?
No, I think that's a poor choice of word, actually, inconclusive.
Right.
Because we did have the factors in the report.
Right.
I don't think I had access, well, I didn't have access to the report when I provided the statement.
You didn't have access to the final post-mortem report?
Yes.
Right. Well, this is about your recollection of your view on the final report.
Yes.
I accept you've said it. Inconclusive maybe isn't the word that you wish to have used there. But you, in reply to me a moment ago, you said the report was unascertained as to the final cause of death. Now that you've had an opportunity to look at the final post-mortem report on the screen,
Yes.
and you've seen the cause of death, do you now think that the report was, the final cause of death was unascertained or inconclusive?
No, it wasn't unascertained. The interim report, I think, from recollection, was unascertained. And
I think that's correct.
yeah, okay. No, I think it was ascertained in relation to the factors that I described earlier.
So from the 18th of June, when the final post-mortem report came in,
Yes.
that cause of death was at that point ascertained.
Yes.
And there was a conclusion drawn by the pathologists.
Yes.
But the interim report, which had been produced at an early stage
That was
after the post-mortem,
Yes.
that was the one that was unascertained.
Unascertained, yes.
Right, thank you. I'm interested about your understanding of the final post-mortem report. On the 30th of August 2015, there was a public statement from the Commissioner yourself in response to a Sunday Mail story. And there's a quotation that says, "The post-mortem conducted in Scotland did not reveal a conclusive cause of death." And then on the 1st of September 2015, so roughly around the same time,
Right.
again, you're quoted as saying, "Despite the fact that the post-mortem conducted shortly after his death was inconclusive, I remain committed to thoroughly investigating all lines of inquiry."
Okay.
But by August, September, you had the final post-mortem.
Right.
The cause of death at that stage was ascertained in the final cause of post-mortem, as you say. Why are public statements being made by you that cause of death was, let me just quote, not conclusive and was inconclusive?
Well, that's not correct, yes.
You accept that those comments as reported are not correct?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Can I ask you about some evidence that we heard from Dr. Shearer and see if you agree with this, if this accords with your understanding at the time. It came from Dr. Shearer's inquiry statement, which for those behind me's benefit, it was SBPI 00304. And it was paragraph 126 of that inquiry statement. We may have that available to come up on the screen. And she talks about pathologically. So it's paragraph 126. Here we are. Do you see around, not quite halfway down that paragraph, she's been asked to comment on a number of other matters. She says, pathologically, so that's from the perspective of her as a forensic pathologist, I cannot say whether the restraint used was adequate or excessive. And would you would agree with that, presumably?
Yeah.
And equally, it's not for her to say whether restraint was adequate or excessive. Would you say it was for PIRC to make an assessment of whether restraint was adequate or excessive as part of the investigation?
I think that would be a matter for Crown Office.
That would be for Crown as well. However, at the end of the day, he was restrained. He was in a position that would have hampered his breathing, hampered his heart, and was intoxicated with drugs. As such, there was a combination of factors that all would have interplayed with each other, and it was difficult to say what has been the more important factor. I think all of them together is important. They have all happened together and resulted in his death. It would be interesting to know what his actual that was in relation to the Dr. Karch. But they all happened together and resulted in his death. And she says altogether they were important. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and I think that probably reflects a number of factors that was in, if I recall, the neuropathology report too.
Right. So you're happy that the explanation given by Dr. Shearer here is that they were all there were a number of factors, they were important factors. Think of them all together was important.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you what your understanding of material contribution is? Do you understand there to be a distinction between material contribution and something that's significant in cause of death?
Material contribution, I would have thought, could be a significant factor.
And in terms of assessing whether something is significant or a material contribution to death, is that something in terms of the PIRC investigation that you were assessing independently, or would you have relied on medical evidence in relation to that?
Relied on the medical expert and the experts.
You talked earlier about a question being asked about possible ultimate charges. Now, you've spoken about considering status of the officers. You've spoken about cause of death. At what point did the PIRC investigation reach a stage where you then send all of that information you've gathered, send it to Crown Office, and ask them to assess matters from their perspective?
I think all of that information was provided in August 15.
The
So
interim report was
yeah.
August 2015.
And my recollection is all of that information was contained in that.
And so was it that at that point that you expect the Crown to then go on and consider questions of ultimately a matter for the Crown, whether they wish to prosecute the officers, consider them? That be a matter for the Crown, not for PIRC.
Yes.
And do you have any role as part of the PIRC investigation to make recommendations to the Crown in relation to the evidence that you've gathered?
No, I don't think that's part of the legislation.
So that is left completely at the door of the Crown.
Yes.
So the purpose of the PIRC investigation is that to simply gather in the evidence that's available and then hand that over to the Crown to make their decisions.
Yes, and gather the evidence, as you say, and report it to Crown Office, and they take the decision in relation to the evidence that's presented.
Thank you. In terms of charges that could be levelled or could be considered as part of the investigation, I've asked you questions about perhaps excessive use of force being used.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked about cause of death. I think you said to me earlier that if it was lesser charges, you wouldn't need to know the cause of death in terms of assessing status of the officers, possible criminal charges.
Well, yeah, depend on what the injuries were, whether they could be tied to a crime.
So you would it would be necessary for you to look at some of the conclusions of the post-mortem report, but you may not necessarily require to have any views about the ultimate charges that were going to be
Yes.
levelled or not levelled.
Mm-hmm.
That's again a matter for the Crown.
It is.
So is it not for PIRC to stray into areas where the Crown may be wishing to form conclusions about whether charges should be levelled in relation to either assault or culpable homicide or possibly murder? That would be for the Crown to decide.
On receipt of the information that was provided, yes.
Thank you. Can I ask?
Sorry, just to interrupt. When I asked you a question earlier, you said that the investigator of PIRC would decide whether to treat someone as a suspect.
Yes.
Now, if you treat someone as a suspect, what would you say to them in terms of the basis of which you were treating them as a suspect?
You would have to identify the crime that they were suspected of.
So at that stage, the PIRC investigator would be having in mind some offence.
Yes. But on occasions, you would consider going back to the Crown if there was a particular change of direction or revelation, as we did by updating them throughout.
Thank you.
Was there a stage in the investigation into the death of Mr. Bayo where PIRC investigators considered the status of the officers at the point where the investigation had reached a stage where you were nearly ready to put forward the interim report? That would be about the August.
Well, my understanding would be that that was being considered throughout the investigation.
And as far as you're concerned, was there ever a discussion or consideration given where PIRC investigators did consider whether there were reasonable prospects of reasonable grounds of suspecting criminality, and considered treating the officers as suspects?
I can't recall a conversation that pointed towards that.
Was there ever a consideration amongst the investigators that you're aware of which considered changing the status of the officers to suspect and considered what possible criminal offences could be they could be questioned in relation to?
Well, as I said, I think it was being considered throughout, but any particular move in the direction that you've described, I don't recall that, and I would have expected that to have been raised with the management within the investigations team.
And with the team, who do you mean when you say the team?
Well, I would have expected the senior investigator to be raising that with potentially the head and director of investigations.
That was Mr. Mitchell.
Yes.
And in relation to considering those aspects and considering whether to change the status of the officers, perhaps considering criminal activity amounting to assault or excessive force of some description, or perhaps culpable homicide or something along those lines. In terms of your investigators, what more evidence, if any, would they have needed in terms of causation beyond the cause of the final post-mortem?
I'm not sure.
And when you say you're not sure, is that because you think they maybe didn't need more than they had at that stage, or you're not sure what might have assisted?
I think I would need to go back to review all the evidence that was available.
Right. So on the basis of what I've been discussing with you today, what more evidence from a pathological point of view or from a medical point of view about cause of death would have assisted that consideration by investigators? So this is after the point at which the final post-mortem is available, and you have information saying that restraint played a material contribution in the cause of death. Was there any more pathological evidence you would have needed to allow a consideration to be given by PIRC investigators about the status of the officers and whether any criminal element activity could be considered?
In relation to the criminal activity, which charges are you focusing on?
Well, let's think about culpable homicide. So that would automatically include the death.
Yes.
It would have to include the death. It wouldn't be simply an assault, which wouldn't necessarily require the death. So let's think about culpable homicide. Would anything more from the pathologist have been required from the perspective of PIRC carrying out an investigation to allow that assessment to be made?
Possibly not.
Is that something that you would have expected your investigators to be considering after the final post-mortem was available?
Yes.
Can I ask you to look at two paragraphs in your statement, 562 and 563? So that's 562. I have been asked why establishing a precise cause of death is necessary for officers to be detained as suspects. For someone to be considered a suspect, there requires to be reasonable cause to suspect that they committed a crime. A precise cause of death would show how the person died. Without a precise cause of death, death may have been due to any number of reasons and not related to the incident. If a precise cause of death was established, which could be linked to a criminal act, then grounds may have been established to provide reasonable cause to suspect that the officers had committed a crime. And then at 563, I have been asked if without establishing a precise cause of death, it would have been possible for the officers to have been detained as suspects for crimes not directly linked to Mr. Bio's death, such as assault. If there had been evidence of other crimes committed by the officers, then if there was a reasonable cause to suspect that they had committed these crimes, then that may have been possible. However, there was no such evidence available, despite the fact that there was evidence that Mr. Bio was found to have minor blunt force injuries. It was not possible to establish either when or how they had occurred, but even if it was accepted that they had been caused in the course of the incident with the officers, it would have been necessary to establish that the officers' actions were not reasonable, necessary or proportionate before the crime of assault could be established. There was no evidence available to show that. I think I perhaps could have made that clearer in the letter. I just want to go back over those two paragraphs with you, just so that I can completely understand your position there, because it's quite complicated.
Yes.
So can we look at 562 first of all, please? I've been asked why establishing a precise cause of death is necessary for officers to be detained as suspects. And I think earlier, as I understood your evidence earlier, you were saying that you could consider whether officers were suspects and consider whether there are reasonable grounds of suspecting criminal activity without having a precise cause of death. Was that correct? Am I correct in that understanding?
I think what I was addressing was the death, yes.
So this is where you're thinking, if you can establish that some activity on the part of the officers was part of the cause of death, this is the scenario you're talking about here.
Yeah.
So would that be the scenario where restraint by the officers was a contributory factor to the cause of death?
Yes.
So this is about the scenario that we have here after the final post-mortem.
Mm-hmm.
And it says a precise cause of death would show how the person died. Without a precise cause of death, death may have been due to any number of reasons and not related to the incident. That's self-explanatory. If a precise cause of death was established, which could be linked to a criminal act, then grounds may have been established to provide reasonable cause to suspect that the officers had committed a crime.
Mm-hmm.
So, where the cause of death attributed restraint as a material contribution to death,
Mm-hmm.
and where you had evidence available, both from Ashley Wise, Kevin Nelson, and you also had the opportunity to do that comparison with the officers' statements that we looked at earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Walker and Payton that were given on the 4th of June.
Mm-hmm.
And you can compare that with the use of force SOP.
Mm-hmm.
And you then have the final post-mortem on the 18th of June,
Yes.
giving the ascertained cause of death. Was that at the point at which all of that evidence was available to PIRC, and it was at that point, on the 18th of June, or shortly thereafter, that there could have been some consideration given by PIRC in relation to whether there was reasonable cause to suspect the officers had committed a crime or criminal activity?
Yes, a crime rather than a crime that resulted in the death.
But if you had the final post-mortem report
Mhm.
on the 18th of June attributing restraint as one of the factors
Mhm.
to cause of death, would that at that stage have permitted PIRC to make some assessment as part of your investigation?
It possibly could have.
Why do you only say possibly? What else would have been required by PIRC?
Well, there are other factors involved in this.
And what other factors would need to be ruled out or explored further at that stage before some sort of assessment could be done by PIRC?
Well, I think that's where the medical experts come into play.
But in terms of thinking of whether there's reasonable cause or reasonable grounds
Yes.
to suspect that the officers had committed a crime,
Mm-hmm.
so we're looking at a stage where they could be considered suspects.
Yes.
What else was required for that assessment to be carried out by PIRC?
Well, I think then you would move to whether the actions were necessary, reasonable, or proportionate.
And where we have looked at the statements of PC Walker and PC Payton, and I think your description was that when we compare those initial actions regarding the use of sprays with the use of force SOP, and the profiled offender behaviour in paragraphs 4.6 and the reasonable officer response in 4.7,
Yes.
you said it seems to have escalated potentially beyond the behaviour that was being demonstrated, and it seems to have moved quickly to a force that does not accord with the circumstances that are being presented. So you have that you have the statements available on the 4th of June. I think before lunch you said within a couple of weeks. That would have been a reasonable time to carry out an assessment, a comparison with the SOP. And on the 18th, which is 2 weeks after the statements are given, you have a cause of death showing material contribution between restraint and death. So in terms of the evidence you have available on the 18th of June, and an assessment by PIRC in relation to considering whether there were reasonable grounds to suspect the officers had committed a crime, what more would you have needed at that stage to carry out that assessment or analysis of whether there were reasonable grounds to suspect the officers?
Yeah, okay. I think my comments related to the officers' actions in relation to spray,
Yes.
which is not or does not reflect the potential for the restraint element.
Right. You've also said that all use of force has to be justified.
Yes.
And if it's not justified as reasonable, necessary and proportionate, then it's not lawful.
Yes.
And so can you explain why this would not be an appropriate time to consider an assessment of whether there's reasonable grounds to suspect officers had committed a crime? Whether it's culpable homicide or something lesser than that.
No, I'm afraid I can't.
So would you have expected, once the final post-mortem report was available, for your investigators to consider whether there were reasonable grounds to suspect in relation
That
to the
a
officers?
crime had been committed.
That a crime had been committed, and whether the officer's status should have been changed from witness to suspect.
I think it could have been considered at that stage.
Right. And again, is that something you would have, that process, that assessment would have been something you would have expected to be noted in the management policy log, if
Yes.
that had been done?
Yes.
There's nothing in the log to suggest it was done, but I'm asking if that's something you would have expected.
I think that would have been a significant decision that you would have expected to feature, yes.
Thank you. And again, is that something, if that assessment had been carried out at that time, that you could have assisted with, if any of your investigators had asked?
Well, I was available, but similarly, the director and the head of investigations would have been their first port of call.
Right. So only if they'd gone to Ms Scullion or Mr Mitchell and not been able to resolve the issue would they have come to you?
I would have been available, but I would have expected that as the natural progression within the investigation team for that process to be followed.
Do you think your experience as a fiscal and as head of Cap D for many years would have assisted in that process if investigators had come to you?
Yes, but equally what we had was very experienced investigators who had participated in a number of serious, murders are always serious, but a number of high-profile murders.
We've heard that Mr McSpadden has told us that he was very interested in alpha PVP, that there wasn't a lot of awareness generally in Scotland at that time about the impact of alpha PVP, and that was something obviously that was named in the cause of death. Looking back now, do you think there was perhaps an overemphasis on investigating alpha PVP, given it was only one factor named in the cause of death?
No, and I'm certainly not aware that Mr McSpadden had a particular interest in that. I know that he explored it, but I don't think as there was a complete lack of knowledge of that drug, that he should not have explored it.
Do you consider alpha PVP to be in any way more significant than ecstasy or restraint in the
No.
cause of death?
No.
Was there any concern that either of those three factors were more or less significant than the others?
Not in my view.
We've heard from Mr. McSpadden that he was sent to America to investigate alpha PVP.
No, that's not correct. He was, as I understand it, he was on a Scottish Government project, and he may very well have undertaken some research.
Right. So PIRC weren't funding his trip to America?
I don't know. It was the Director of Investigations who, I think, nominated him. I don't know if it was a Scottish Government funded project or not.
You don't remember if it was the government funding it or PIRC?
Scottish Government were organising it. I don't know who funded it, yes.
Right. And was it a Scottish Government project, as you say, not anything to do with PIRC?
I can't remember the terms of that. I recall that Mr. Mitchell, I presume, was contacted about it, and he considered that Mr. McSpadden would be a suitable candidate to nominate.
I wonder if you can give me a moment, please. I wonder if that might be an appropriate time to...
We'll take a 15-minute break now. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on for the remainder. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be possible if we could just go back to the last session, because you were asking about whether PIRC should have reverted to Crown Office. My recollection is, the process is, that it was Crown's report. The postmortem report went into Crown Office before it came to us and was shared with the family solicitor at that time. So in respect to the question about who should be referring what to whom and who should be assessing the suspect, Crown Office had a role at the beginning on receipt of the report before it was actually even shared with us.
Do you remember when it was shared with you? It's dated the 18th of June.
I don't remember the precise date. I would imagine it would be within a day or two.
And is there still an expectation on PIRC investigators at that point to take matters forward and continue with the investigation in light of the information you now had about cause of death?
Yes, the investigation was continuing, but the point I'm making is the post-mortem report was commissioned by Crown Office. Crown Office received it before it came to PIRC.
And do you remember now if any guidance or discussion took place with Crown in light of the post-mortem report?
I'm not aware of any discussion that took place.
You weren't party to that?
No.
If it did take place?
Yes, that's right.
And if your lead investigator or any of the investigators had wanted to have a discussion with the Crown about the post-mortem, would they have done that at some point shortly after the 18th of June?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And is that the sort of thing that might have been noted in the management policy log?
Yes, I don't have an issue in relation to what should have been in the policy log. My point is the report was sent to Crown Office before it even came to PIRC.
Was that the normal practice?
Yes, these reports are commissioned by Crown Office.
And when post-mortem reports are sent to Crown Office, is there, when Crown then forwarded that to PIRC, or at the time when Crown forwarded it to PIRC, was there any additional information or commentary given by Crown, or was it simply forwarded to PIRC for consideration by PIRC?
I don't know, it wasn't forwarded to me. I think Mr. Mitchell perhaps may have had a role in that.
All right. So it may be that Mr. Mitchell can help us with that
Possibly.
further. Thank you. Can I move on then and ask you about another of the 5 principles?
Yes.
And this one I'm interested in is reasonably prompt.
Yes.
So the matters have to be done without delay, if I can use that expression.
Yes.
Or without unreasonable delay. Now, we've heard evidence that there was a delay in investigators from PIRC arriving at Kirkcaldy Police Office on the 3rd of May. I don't know if you're aware of any of the questions that I've asked about
No.
that. And we've heard that PIRC were initially instructed by the Crown at 9:35 on the 3rd of May.
Mm-hmm.
And they arrived at Kirkcaldy Police Office at round about 1:30 in the afternoon. Now, I think you were asked about this in your inquiry statement.
I was, yes.
And I wonder if I can ask for your views about that period between the initial instruction and then investigators actually arriving at Kirkcaldy, which was obviously between 9:35 and 13:30.
Mm-hmm. My expectation would be that they would get there as quickly as possible. I think I made the point in my statement that unlike Police Scotland, who had a number of officers on duty, the PIRC investigators were at home, they were on call. They then gathered themselves at the office where they were briefed and then moved on to Kirkcaldy to take over the investigation.
Do you have any concerns about the period between the instruction and their arrival at Kirkcaldy?
Yeah, as I say, I would like them to get there, or would have liked them to have got there sooner. I don't know, I wasn't there on that day in relation to what may or may not have prevented that happening.
But just looking in terms of timescale, does the timescale they arrived meet the expectations you had of your staff?
I expected them to be there as soon as they could. I don't know how long that took or why.
Did you consider with any of your investigators why it took so long when you did come back to the office?
No, I didn't explore that with them. I don't know if I was actually aware that of the time they arrived.
Right. I think in your inquiry statement you actually comment on one of the first Gold Group meeting.
Yes.
We've heard evidence that the first Gold Group meeting took place at 11:30 that morning, so that around 2 hours after PIRC had been instructed.
Yes.
And we've also heard that no one from PIRC was present at that time. Do you have any concerns about the fact that a Gold Group meeting was being held at 11:30 and no one from PIRC was present?
Yes, I think it would have been preferable if there had been a PIRC presence at that meeting.
And how would you have resolved that issue in terms of making sure someone from PIRC was present? If you had been fixing the meeting, when would you have had the first Gold Group meeting?
If I was fixing the Police Scotland Gold Group meeting?
Well, if you were fixing a Gold Group meeting, yes. If you'd had an input into it or a contribution to make in terms of when it took place.
Well, I think it would have been possible for a PIRC investigator to have been there at 11:30.
And are you aware of a reason why no one from PIRC was present at 11:30?
My understanding is that they gathered together at the office for the briefing.
You say it would have been possible for someone from PIRC to be there. Would it have caused any problems as far as you're concerned if one of the investigators had gone to Kirkcaldy for that Gold Group meeting?
I couldn't have seen that there had been a problem with that.
We've heard that now many of these things are on Teams or online.
Right.
At that time in 2015, was there ever a view taken about whether they could join a meeting by telephone?
Yes, of course they could have joined by telephone. I don't know if they were aware of the Gold Group meeting.
Right. All right. Can I ask you about the interim report that was ultimately sent by PIRC to the Crown? And you were asked about this, and I think we've heard that the interim report went on the 7th of August,
Yes.
2015, which was round about 3 months after the death of Mr. Bio. Can you explain to the Chair what is the purpose of an interim report from PIRC to Crown?
I think there was a recognition that there would be further work required in relation to medical experts. And that certainly was, I suppose, the direction of travel with Crown Office staff at the meetings, that further experts would require to be commissioned.
What was the purpose of getting further medical experts to give reports?
Well, it was a range of experts in relation to the various factors that had been identified in the postmortem report.
So it was experts regarding 2 factors in the postmortem report. Would that have been the MDMA?
It would have been, yes, the drugs overall, but I think the more, or certainly one of the significant features was the impact on the heart and the cardiac impact. Right. We also explored the restraint and the sprays.
So you explored the drugs that would relate to toxicology?
Yes.
And the impact on the the heart, cardiac matters, would that be of the restraint or of the drugs or both?
Both?
And then the restraint itself?
Yes.
And the sprays?
Yes.
And the interim report having been sent to Crown, was it at that stage that the Crown then came back and asked PIRC to investigate further with medical experts or other experts?
Yes, well, I think there was a discussion. It may have just been before the report went. I can't honestly remember.
We've heard the interim report went on the 7th of August,
Mm-hmm.
and we've heard that the Crown sent a further letter of instruction on the 2nd of September.
Right.
And that evidence has been heard about that letter of the 2nd of September and how there were expanded or enlarged terms of reference.
Yes, I recall that.
You remember that
Yes.
now?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to ask you about, we'll come on to this in a moment, but at that stage, Mr. Wixborn gave evidence that it was expected that the Crown would come back to PIRC if they had further questions and queries.
Yes.
Was that quite common practice
Yes.
for further letters of instruction to be sent to PIRC?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, interim report is around 350 odd pages long. It's a substantial document.
Mm-hmm.
Went to the Crown. Was it only as a result of further queries from the Crown that delayed a final report being sent? Or was there anything else that PIRC were expecting to do at that stage?
I think the expectation from discussions with Crown were that there would be further medical evidence sought.
Right. If the terms of reference had not been expanded, was that effectively going to be the end of the investigation by PIRC?
I think in terms of what had been originally directed,
Yes.
yes.
In terms of PIRC investigators' involvement with the instruction of experts,
Yes.
what, in your awareness, what experience did investigators have for instructing expert reports?
I don't think they had much experience within PIRC. I don't know if they'd had experience in any of their former careers.
Was that not something you were aware of, whether they had experience in former careers?
No, I haven't.
We've heard that many of them were former police officers.
Yes.
And we've heard that some of them came from other fields. One worked for the fire service in the past. We've heard that one of them came from the caring side of matters. So they weren't all from former police officers.
Yes, that's right.
Did you have any awareness at all of the extent to which your investigators had been involved in instructing expert reports prior to the Sheku Bio investigation?
No, I didn't have a finite knowledge of that, no.
When you say finite knowledge, what do you mean by that?
I was aware that they would have been involved with experts at some point in some of the investigations. What the level of their involvement was, I didn't know.
We've heard that until a formal letter was sent on the 2nd of September, that we've heard evidence that there was no active line of investigation being pursued in relation to race, in relation to the death of Mr. Bio. Was that something that you were aware of, had been briefed on or discussed?
Well, from discussion with various members, I was aware that it was a matter that was being considered at the time, not actively being investigated as a separate strand, but there was consideration throughout, in particular in relation to whether there would have been any difference in the interaction of the officers with Mr. Bio if he had been of a different ethnic origin.
We've heard it described that PIRC investigators were to take cognizance
Yes.
of any issues of race as they emerged. We've heard evidence that from one of your investigators that, as far as he was concerned, nothing did emerge.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard it being described as being mindful of race or keeping an open mind about race.
Mm-hmm.
Does that all accord with your understanding of where PIRC were in relation to the question of race?
Yes, as I say, my understanding was that it was being considered alongside the investigation throughout.
And when you say your understanding was it was being considered, but not an active line of investigation, can you explain what your understanding at the time was about that distinction?
Well, probably, just as you said, that they would take cognizance if any evidence emerged.
Did you consider as Commissioner that your terms of reference at that time to investigate the circumstances of Mr. Bio's death would have permitted PIRC investigators to actively investigate whether race was a factor?
I would have expected a specific direction from Crown Office about that.
And in the absence of a specific direction, Crown having simply given a general direction, if I can put it that way, to investigate the circumstances, did you consider that your terms of reference did not permit an active line of investigation in relation to race?
I don't think it would have prevented it.
And if it wasn't prevented, can you help us understand why there wasn't that active line of investigation pursued?
Well, I think there was the consideration that was given throughout. Without moving on to the further lines of investigation that were effectively undertaken in relation to trends within Fife Division and exploring various matters that subsequently were brought to our attention.
What were your expectations then in terms of your investigators? If they're not pursuing an active line of investigation but they're taking cognizance
Yes.
of issues to do with race, what did you expect investigators to be doing in relation to race between the 3rd of May and the beginning of September, when the terms of reference expanded into race?
If there was evidence that in the course of the investigation of the death they uncovered that would then have been, I would have thought, probably referred to Crown Office.
Right. So we've heard that from 4th June, statements were obtained from officers.
Yes.
Did you read those statements when they were obtained?
I read some of them in relation to the officers' active engagement with Mr. Bio at Hayfield Road, really to identify who had taken whatever action in connection with Mr. Bio.
And did you analyse those statements from that perspective?
I didn't formally analyse them. I suppose I compared them for my own purpose. My recollection is that, again, there was some media commentary around which officers had taken part, and there was there was ongoing commentary as to what the potential impact of that was, and whether Constable Short could have been assaulted in the way that some had described.
Right.
So in connection with that, there was ongoing media interest in that, and there seemed to be a discrepancy between both sides of that commentary in relation to what was physically possible.
When you looked at the statements from the officers, did you consider the language that was being used by the officers?
Yes. I don't think that there was any reference to language at the Hayfield Road incident when they were actually hands-on, that I can recall.
Do you remember reading the statements and seeing any references to the word coloured? Or any references being made that linked the fact that Mr. Bio was black with potential terrorism?
I recall, yes, I do.
You recall those? And what steps, if any, did you take having noticed those references in the officers' statements?
I think there was some discussion with Mr. McSporran in relation to that.
Tell us about that discussion.
Well, an identification that there had been language used like that.
And having identified that, what actions or tasks were taken by PIRC in response to that?
I don't recall what action was taken in response to that.
So, did you consider those references to language about coloured or linking the fact he was black with terrorism, did you consider those as issues that were emerging which related potentially to race?
Potentially, yes. However, on raising them, and I think that was with Mr. Mitchell, the view taken was that these were misconduct matters.
We've heard that misconduct matters are ones for Police Scotland.
Yes,
is that
that's
correct?
right.
But we've heard that PIRC investigators were to take cognizance or be mindful of issues relating to race as they emerged.
Yes.
And if you consider that the use of that type of language was potentially the emerging of issues relating to race, was that not a point at which action should have been taken by PIRC?
I think
Either to seek an expansion of the terms of reference or something along those lines?
Well, I think my awareness related to the terrorism aspect, and I can't recall whether that was referred to in a racial fashion.
Well, we've heard from PC Kaylee Good, who was at Hayfield Road.
Right.
We've asked her about her PIRC statement, which she gave on the 4th of June.
Uh-huh.
And she made reference to the use of the word coloured in
Right.
relation to Mr. Bio,
Right.
which could have potential racial connotations, implications. And that she linked the fact that Mr. Bio was black with a potential terrorist incident
Right.
at Hayfield Road.
Mm-hmm.
Again, something that from which perhaps inferences could be drawn in relation to race.
Mm-hmm.
And this emerged in the statements taken by PIRC on the 4th of June.
Right.
And I'm wondering what action PIRC took in light of that, or what action now, sitting here, you think PIRC should have taken in relation to
yes, my expectation would have been that the investigators would have gone back to explore whether there was any racial connotation.
And when you say go back and
Sorry, go
explore-
back to re-interview the police witnesses. So, for example, Constable Good.
So any references such as the use of coloured or links to terrorism or potential terrorism, you think that would have merited going back to the officers who relied on that or
Yes.
mentioned that in their statement?
Yes, I would have expected that.
And you having noticed this, when you looked at the statements, did you instruct the investigators to do that?
Well, I certainly had the discussion highlighting that.
And that was with Mr. McSpadden?
Yes.
And how long after that you looked at the statements was it that you spoke to Mr. McSpadden about this?
I think very shortly.
After the 4th of June?
Well, whenever I saw the statements, I don't know if that was on the 4th of June or not.
Do you have any recollection at all of how long after they'd been obtained that you read them?
Well, it'd be after they were typed. I don't know when they were typed up.
All right. How long did statements normally take to get typed up?
Well, in this case, because of the volume, it was delayed.
Right. By how much?
I can't remember.
Right. And having raised that with Mr. McSpadden, what was your expectation of what he would then do in relation to saying there's these references and statements, investigators may go back?
I would have
and
expected
clarify these?
him to have directed the investigators to go back to the witnesses.
Within a reasonable period, they would go back?
Yes.
What would a reasonable period be?
Whenever there was an opportunity, dependent on the priorities that were being undertaken.
All right. And would you did you instruct Mr. McSpadden to speak to Crown about this, having become aware of these references in the statements?
I don't recall doing that, no.
Is that something you would have expected Mr. McSpadden to do anyway?
Yes, potentially, I would think he could have done that.
Is that something you would have expected him to do independently?
To have flagged it up, yes.
To the Crown. Did you check up that had been carried out by Mr. McSpadden?
I followed that up with a conversation with Mr. Mitchell,
Tell us about that conversation.
highlighting the issue or potential issue, and the discussion at that stage was that he was of the view that it was a misconduct matter.
Do you remember when that discussion took place?
No, I couldn't tell you.
I think in your inquiry statement, we could maybe look at it on the screen, 397. I've been asked if prior to the 3rd of May 2015 PIRC had ever considered the issue of race within an investigation. I don't remember it featuring in an investigation in the preceding months. When you refer to preceding months, is that from August 2014 when you took up your role?
Yes.
So you're not aware of any investigations during your time before Mr. Bio's death
That's right.
where race had been under consideration?
Yes.
Did you have experience at that time of an investigation being carried out where race was a factor in any of your professional career?
Yes, whilst I worked with the Procurator Fiscal Service.
Can you tell us anything about that investigation?
Yes, it related to a Chinese national who had been assaulted, and racial comments had been made at the time of the assault.
We've heard we've heard things like that described as sort of overt
Yes.
racist comments being made
Mhm.
at the times. That was a situation you had experience of in your time as a fiscal.
Yes.
And at 265 of your inquiry statement, you say you expected direction and guidance from the Crown, I think. 265. I've been asked if I was content with the direction, instruction and support that PIRC received from Crown Office in relation to the investigation. I think the various terms of reference in this investigation were generally fine in relation to what they expected to be investigated, apart from the one which simply copied on correspondence from a third party. PIRC would expect to receive direction and guidance from Crown Office in relation to any issues arising in the course of investigations. And would that include any questions regarding race?
Yes.
So if, as they did, issues emerged from the statements of the officers, would you have expected the Crown to be in a position to provide PIRC with further guidance regarding the issues that were arising from the statements?
Yes, I would, because those statements were supplied to Crown Office.
And when they were supplied to Crown Office, was there some sort of indication given to the Crown that further guidance was being sought from PIRC on the issue of race?
No, I'm not aware of that.
So I think in 266, you're asked again if you were content with the guidance provided. While some guidance was received, there were a number of instances of guidance being sought but not provided. For example, when PIRC sought guidance about how to assess whether the officer's actions had been influenced by race. At the original meeting with Crown Office staff about this, we expressed concerns about the feasibility of assessing whether race had any influence on the officer's actions in the absence of any evidence of overt actions, and sought guidance. No guidance was provided, and it was not until we re-raised this at a subsequent meeting that the difficulties in making such an assessment were recognised. So was that recognised by the Crown?
Yes.
Was this at the stage that the Crown had expanded the terms of reference to include race, or was this at an earlier stage?
No, I think it was following the expanded terms of reference.
And you said express concerns about the feasibility of whether race had an influence on the officer's actions in the absence of any evidence of overt actions,
Yes.
and sought guidance. And we've heard from Mr. McSporran that he was also looking for any overt references to race.
Yes.
He indicated that it was quite difficult to assess race if there was no overt comments made at the time or such like. Would you agree with that?
I think potentially the focus was in relation to the actual interaction with Mr. Bio and whether there were any overt comments or indications at that time.
Right. And in the absence of that, obviously PIRC sought guidance.
Yes.
What guidance were you given by the Crown about looking for evidence about race or potential race implications where there were no overt comments made?
Well, as I've said here, that wasn't until it was re-raised as a difficulty that I think there was a recognition of the difficulty. So there, as I recall, was no specific guidance in relation to in the absence of any overt actions.
Did the Crown, after it was re-raised,
Yes.
provide PIRC with guidance or direction about identifying evidence that might be of assistance in considering whether race was a factor?
I think at the original meeting there was discussion around, well, it was the assessment of complaints, racial complaints provided, and that was pre the, I think it was October or November meeting. So
there was some guidance provided that PIRC should look at previous complaints
Yes.
and issues that may have been raised in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned a moment ago statistics or assessing. Was that in relation to Fife Police?
That's right, and contrasting any complaints of that nature against the broader Police Scotland.
And what guidance, if any, was given to PIRC about investigating the not the past, not statistics, but the actual events which took place at Hayfield Road? Was there any guidance given about evidence from which inferences could possibly be drawn?
I don't recall any guidance of that nature.
Was there any discussion when you talked to Crown about this, about what should we as PIRC investigators look for in terms of evidence concerning race that could potentially give rise to inferences that race was a factor?
No, other than the trends, I don't recall any particular guidance given.
Right. And was there anyone within PIRC, in the team of PIRC, in your investigators, who had been in a position, who had experience of investigating cases where race was a factor?
I understood so, yes.
Who were they?
I can't remember which members of staff now. Potentially Mr. McSporran.
All right.
But I'm really hazarding a guess on that.
Okay. Were you satisfied that your team of investigators had sufficient experience to investigate whether race was a factor in the death of Mr. Bile?
Well, a good number of them were very experienced investigators who had previously investigated these matters. I do recognise, however, that if there had been available resources that would have allowed the staff to have further training on this, that would have been beneficial.
Right. Was that something you identified before or after the death of Mr. Bile?
Before.
And had you sought additional resources for the purposes of training your investigators in relation to race investigations?
I don't think specifically in relation to race investigations, but in relation to equality and diversity and training generally. My memory is that that was identified as part of the bid that was put into Scottish Government, that obviously there needed to be further funds to allow resources. And it wasn't just for training, but for other abstractions, such as attending court to give evidence. None of that had been recognised.
When did you make that request for further resources for training in equality and diversity?
No, it wasn't specifically in relation to training and equality and diversity. It was in relation just to training generally, global training, and the advancement of professional development.
Right. And when was that request made for further resources to allow for that to be done?
I can't remember which budget bid that was included in. There were a number of bids.
Was it before the death of Mr. Bile or after?
I don't know.
Before the death of Mr. Bile, had you identified the need for additional training in relation to investigations, particularly where race may have been a factor?
I hadn't specifically identified that, no.
Would that have been something within your remit to identify gaps in training for your investigators and trying to plug those gaps?
The responsibility for that lay with the Director of Investigations.
So that was Mr. Mitchell.
Yes.
Did Mr. Mitchell ever raise with you the fact that there may have been a need for further training for investigators in relation to investigations, and in particular investigations where race was a factor?
No, I don't recall that.
Were you aware of any deficiencies in relation to diversity regarding the investigations team per se?
In relation to diversity within the investigations team, I think it was recognised that it wasn't a particularly diverse team.
And when you say not particularly, what do you mean?
Well, the diversity extended really to a gender balance. Well, maybe not a balance, but there were a number of females in relation to those from other black or ethnic minority groups. I don't recall other investigators being there. There were members, well, at least one member of the review team and others that were from either a black or ethnic minority group.
You think there were investigators?
No, not investigators,
Oh,
the
sorry.
review team and also the corporate services. There was a temporary appointment there.
In terms of your investigation team,
No,
no black investigators?
No.
Or investigators from any ethnic minority?
no.
Did you see that as being a matter for concern?
Yes, I would have liked to have a workforce that represented all groups.
And what steps did you take to encourage recruitment of those from a more diverse background?
There were some limitations around that because of the funding and the fact that very few of the investigations team at that stage, having just recently joined the organisation, were leaving. So effectively the complement remained static for a considerable length of time until some additional resources, and we talked this morning in relation to what was made available. I think another 2 over and above what we had. We were capable of recruiting. I can't remember if at that time or if it was a later advancement of funds where we specifically took the steps to advertise posts in sources where we thought there would be a greater diverse range.
And you've said you have eventually got resources for an additional 2 investigators. You mentioned that this morning.
Yes.
What steps did you take at that stage to encourage recruitment in areas involving a more ethnically diverse group of people?
We were also undertaking presentations at various educational establishments to reach a broad populace.
And what were those educational establishments?
Well, the colleges and schools.
Did that expose PIRC and raise awareness about PIRC and its role amongst a wider group than had previously been reached?
Yes.
And was any of that outreach work, did it bear fruit in relation to diversity?
Well, not in relation to the 2 that were added to the complement, no.
We heard one of the previous witnesses talk about perhaps some targeting in terms of where recruitment adverts were placed and advertised. Is that
Yes.
something that you had a hand in?
Yes, it was.
Tell us about that.
Well, I think there was a recognition of the lack of diversity, and I can't remember if it was or at around what time there was a review of the organisational more broadly, and I think at that time there was an understanding that any vacancies should be advertised in such sources.
Do you remember the locations of any of the adverts that you...
No, that was handled by the HR team.
HR. Thank you. Can I ask you about what was available to your investigators in-house at that time in May 2015? Was there any guidance available to investigators in relation to investigations where race was a factor? Were there any guidelines or information sheets or anything of that sort?
The only information guidance was contained in the on-call pack that investigators had, obviously, when they were on call.
Can you tell us about the on-call pack and what that contained?
It contained a variety of documents which had been put together, I think, from at the early stages of PIRC, providing guidance on a whole range of matters, both in relation to the legislation, their powers, on-call numbers for others. It was quite it was a file probably of this size.
Are you talking about the blue folder?
Yes,
in
the lever
front of
arch,
you?
yes.
And was that something that contained guidance for investigators about investigations where race was a factor?
No, it didn't specifically contain, as I recall, it didn't specifically contain guidance on investigations into racial matters. It contained information in relation to various faiths and different cultures.
Right. And to what use would that information have been to investigators investigating a death where race was a possible factor?
There was some information in that in relation to postmortems and the positioning of a body.
And in terms of postmortem information, tell us what guidance was available to investigators in that regard. We've heard that some religions have views in relation to whether a postmortem should take place, when a body should be buried or such like.
Yes.
Is that the type of information that you're thinking of that's
Yes.
contained within this?
Yes.
Can I ask, was there anything available to investigators in around May 2015 which actually gave guidance about an investigation where race is a factor, looking at possible lines of investigation or possible evidence that can be sought, or anything along those lines?
I'm not aware of that, but that again would be held within the investigation team, and I wouldn't expect to be cited in every document that was held there.
So were you not aware of whether or not your investigators had any guidance available in relation to...
I wasn't aware of any guidance that was available to them.
Does it cause you concern, looking back now, as commissioner? So you are the commissioner. Part of your role is strategic planning, development, and you have an investigation team carrying out what you hope to be Article 2 compliant investigations. That they're dealing with the death of a black man in police custody or after contact with the police. You're not aware of any training that they've had in relation to investigations of that sort. You're not aware of any guidance that's available to them. You think perhaps Mr. McSporran had experience, but you're not aware of what experience they had. And looking back now, do you think that perhaps you could have done more in terms of strategy and planning to support your investigators in this investigation, to ensure that it was adequate?
Well, yes, I think all of us, with the benefit of hindsight, could have contributed some degree of experience and expertise to it. However, the Director of Investigations had a responsibility in relation to ensuring the investigative response within that team.
All right. And looking back now, obviously we have the benefit of hindsight now.
Mm-hmm.
So looking back now to 2015, and the Chair will wish to think about what improvements could perhaps be made. Thinking of that now, do you have any reflections on what improvements could perhaps have been made to support your investigators?
I understand now that there's been an adaptation of the IOPC investigative document, which clearly will be of benefit.
We've, I don't know if you've seen them, we have we have heard evidence to some extent on guidelines that are now available. Can I show you those? PIRC 04724. And you see these are headed up PIRC, and they say PIRC guidelines for dealing with allegations of discrimination when undertaking investigations and complaint handling reviews.
Yes.
Was this something that you had a hand in preparing?
No, I didn't.
And if we can go on to the next page, please. You see the contents there, the Commissioner's forward word, and then there's comments about professional standards and ethics, and identification of what is discrimination. And then you'll see that it's section 6, it says conducting an investigation or a case handling review. We're obviously interested in investigation. Can we perhaps look at the Commissioner's forward? And there's a recognition it's crucial for public confidence in the independent investigation and review of complaints that allegations of discrimination against the police are handled properly. Am I correct in saying you would agree with that?
I would.
Yes. And if we can look at section, well, can we look at the bottom of that, please? And it's titled Michelle McLeod Commissioner. This is after you left PIRC.
Yes.
Can we look at section 6? Which I think it says page 30, but I think when we looked at this last time, it was actually 31 on the PDF. I may be wrong. If we can keep going, please. Here we are, conducting an investigation, section 6. And there's a recognition that investigators should have detailed understanding of equality and diversity issues, an appropriate level of knowledge, skills and experience to be able to apply these guidelines and undertake effective investigations. And there's comment about terms of reference. For an investigation into a death that raises issues of discrimination should explicitly refer to and address any discrimination allegations raised. And is that something that would have assisted PIRC in 2015 if specific terms of reference had been provided?
Yes, it would have.
This includes where discrimination is alleged as an aggravating factor in relation to a separate criminal or complaint allegation, or where no specific allegation of discrimination has been made, but it is apparent that discrimination may be a relevant consideration.
Yes.
And we can go on, understanding the allegation of discrimination. And so there's some guidance there for investigators, I should say, about understanding an allegation of discrimination. And is that the type of guidance that would have been of assistance in 2015?
I think it would have been.
And can we carry on? There's sections highlighted in purple, and then conducting the investigation, understanding acquired at the beginning of the investigation or review to consider how the alleged discrimination might present and what stereotypes or prejudicial assumptions might have informed the officer or staff members' actions should inform the key lines of inquiry. For investigations, standard lines of inquiry should be followed to try and find out what happened and why. And then there's a number of suggestions about the type of evidence that could be sought. An investigation will need to consider whether there is other evidence which supports the allegation of discrimination, and this includes complaint history and patterns of behaviour. You see that?
Yes.
Keep going. Comparator evidence. Do you see that?
Yes.
Comparing how the person may have been treated compared to someone who was white, for example.
And that was a consideration as part of the investigation.
And when you say that, is that after the terms of reference were expanded?
No, right from the beginning that was discussed.
And who discussed that at the beginning?
It was, well, I'd certainly discussed it with a number of the investigation team.
Who was that?
I discussed it with Mr. Mitsporan, Mrs. Scullion, Mr. Mitchell, and a variety of other investigators.
And what response did you get when you raised this issue with these investigators?
Well, they were receptive to that.
And when you say receptive,
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they indicated that if there was any evidence in the course of their investigations that emerged, I think was the phrase that we've used before, that would be a matter that would be taken forward, whether with Crown Office or advanced as part of an investigation.
Right. And was this viewed as a positive and active line of investigation, or was it viewed in the context of taking cognizance of issues as they emerge?
I think it would be more under the second, the taking cognizance of.
Right, thank you. And can we move on with going through the document, please? And then there's a mention of discriminatory language.
Yes.
The investigator should assess the language used, including language used in any records relating to the incident in question or arising from the complaint investigation. This includes any use of obviously discriminatory language, but also more subtle indicators that a person may have acted or made a decision based on prejudicial assumptions.
Yes.
There are terms that are commonly recognised as being offensive, and officers and police staff members should be expected not to use them.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are other words and phrases which are inoffensive in themselves, but when heard in context, can reasonably be thought of as discriminatory. Is that some guidance that your investigators in 2015 may have found to be of assistance?
Yes.
And keep moving through the document, please. Making generalisations. Speaking in generalisations may be an indication that a person is making judgments based on assumptions rather than individual circumstances and the evidence and intelligence available to them. Was that something that was considered in 2015?
I don't recall whether it was or whether it wasn't.
Can you remember any examples where it was considered by your investigators?
No, I can't.
And then reference to a characteristic which is irrelevant to the policing purpose. In some circumstances, describing a person's race, religion, gender, age, disability will be relevant to a legitimate policing purpose, i.e. to help identify a suspect or victim, or to provide a service that takes account of a person's individual needs. However, reference to clearly irrelevant details about a person that distinguish them as different may suggest a discriminatory approach.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something that your officers were considering in 2015?
I think, I do think that they would have some awareness and recognition of that.
And what makes you think they would have had some awareness of that in 2015?
For the simple reason that they had an awareness of diversity and equality.
And was it your expectation that your investigators would have had awareness of diversity and equality?
Yes.
Was that based on training you presumed they obtained as former police officers?
No, I was aware that they had training, or those that had been former police officers, a number of them had diversity training, and some from other organisations, but that apart, there was training within the organisation.
And was that available before Mr. Bio died or after?
I understand it was available before.
Was it before you came into your post or after you came into post?
I think it was after.
All right. And as far as you recall, did all your investigators have that training in equality and diversity?
It was a mandatory course.
Right, thank you. Now, I'm conscious of the time. We're about to move on to proving the officer's account, but I wonder if you could give me a moment, please. Would that be an appropriate time?
We'll stop there and sit at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you.